several months ago, and it turned out to be a wonderful chat fest of memories of where we lived and how we wound up in Bridgeton. And I said, well, we're going to do that again. And she says, well, why don't you organize it? And at a particular time, there was the display up for TWA in the front windows. And we said that was a good place to start. So this is we're going to try to make this an ongoing series. And so, in case somebody has to leave, I want to make sure that you know that next month we're going to bring a program in December. It'll be the 11th. I'm thinking it's going to be at 10 o'clock in the morning, but make sure you check on that because it's availability of the room. So keep an eye out for notices. But we're going to talk about holidays. How did you spend your holidays in Bridgeton? What churches did you belong to where they had festivities and what did they do, or where did you go to shop? And maybe it would be your memories of Northwest Plaza. So I wanted to make sure that you understood that we were going to be trying to do this every month and try to pull in a different topic so that we would get these memories recorded, because a lot of us will not be around forever and they'll only be in newspaper articles or something like that. And so for research and people that want to know about Bridgeton, what it was like, good. This is something that we're doing that's positive and recalling our different memories. This morning is one of the first in the series. The people that will be speaking to you today are from TWA. I'm not sure, but I remember that I'm looking over here at Mr. Kelly, and I know that he worked for, did you work for TWA or Ozark?
Both.
Both, okay, fine. But a lot of people lived in Bridgeton that worked for the airlines.
I had
It was a
more
good
on the
place. It was,
table.
it was a close time, you didn't have to drive very far, but, we lived. But Bridgeton at that time, I would say, was not close to the airport, because my memory of living in Bridgeton was, there was a time when if you knew what bank of trees to look to, and there was like a little cut in the trees, and at 9 o'clock in the morning thereabouts, and at 6 o'clock in the evening, 9 o'clock you saw this plane take off. Way over in the distance, 6 o'clock in the evening, there was a plane that landed. Those were jets. That was, one left in the morning and one came back at night. And you could barely see it. You had to know where to look, over the trees to locate it. So the airport was not always sitting on top of us. It was some distance away. But people did live in this locale because it was proximate to the airport, and if they worked over there, if they worked at McDonald, it was McDonald aircraft at the time, they were close to work. So this morning I'm going to introduce Rosalind Janet Hawkins and Mr. Bill Vance, who now works at the library, and they are going to recall their days as employees of TWA. As Rosalind said earlier, she brings both sides, management and employee perspectives. And I hope you enjoy it, and we're going to have some refreshments, and you will see just what it was like to be in the presence of a stewardess or a steward. I hope you enjoy. Come again for other presentations. Thank you.
Okay, is this working now? Is this working now? Hello? Is this working now?
Yes.
Bill,
Is it working?
Bill? Okay, I'm on my way. Get my glasses. Bill?
He's doing his job as a steward there, so he's
The TV is not working.
TV is not going to cooperate.
The TV is not going to cooperate. Okay, flight attendants, prepare your doors for departure and cross check.
I want to welcome you on board Trans World Airlines flight number 2014 from California around the world, landing in Bridgeton. As you know, TWA had an impact on the world economy, prior to being TWA and prior to when any of us were even born. It started with aviation in World War I. It started with aviation in World War I with the surplus airplanes and Charles Lindbergh with the innovative idea to carry the United States mail by airplane. It then moved into carrying passengers. Originally, under the Hoover administration, these United States mail routes were granted without, I think, the okay of Congress and the Senate, as I understand it, dividing up the nation. The overseas routes were given to Pan American Airlines, the eastern routes to Eastern Airlines, the southern to American Airlines, and the west coast to the east coast to Western and TAT, which were encouraged to merge and became Trans World Airlines. Failing because of poor mechanical equipment, TWA was failing. And Howard Hughes was approached by to help TWA. Howard Hughes didn't want to help, he wanted to own, he bought us. I started with TWA in 1964 when Howard Hughes was still a part of TWA, and I do believe I actually saw Howard Hughes, and I knew many people that related stories about being with Howard Hughes. So TWA was influencing Bridgeton, being in the center of the United States before we were born. TWA, I refer to my notes here. Welcome aboard.
Security check.
My cabin crew helping me on this flight today is Bill Vance. He was introduced as having worked for TWA and now working for the library. And I want to introduce Rose, who prefers to stay in the background. Rose and her staff are the most wonderful people, and I think this is absolutely the best library in the system. And she has made all of this possible, and please give a hand to Rose.
Just don't forget the next date is written in the December handout right there, and it's looking back, Churches of Bridgeton, December 11 at 1.
1 o'clock.
Yes, and it's in here, so.
Okay, as I stated earlier, the reason that I have come forward is simply to document this as I know it. And so I'm going to press forward now after giving you a brief historical background on TWA. How many remember the day President Kennedy was assassinated? All of you remember where you were, do you not? You even remember that the Beatles had just invaded the United States of America. And the music was "I Want to Hold Your Hand." And we were all wearing coiffed hair and short dresses, right? I was working for an advertising agency next door to the Jack Fry Training Center in Kansas City. This is where I think I saw Howard Hughes standing outside the building. I walked across the street and applied for the job, and they hired me. So then I got on a thing of how many airlines would hire me. I also applied with American, Continental, Western, and they all hired me. And then I stayed on with the advertising agency for a time. ultimately, by the time I went to TWA, they'd hired me 3 times. I figured if the fools wanted me that much, they deserved me. So here I am. So I started airline hostess training February 22nd of 1965. And it's been a life experience and a ride that I wouldn't trade for anything in the world. We went through 6 weeks of training. We were on probation for 6 months. Our first trip was an observation trip. My observation trip was from Kansas City to St. Louis. And in those days, we wore hats, white gloves, had to wear high heels and a girdle. Of course, we weren't allowed to weigh much over 100 pounds. We all had trouble keeping our girdles up. But it was a joke, and they really did check us. We had to go in for weight check, and some flight attendants were fired when they wore a size 4 uniform because they didn't pass weight check. But why I ask you to recall President Kennedy, we also recall job opportunities, good and bad, and discrimination, gender, and also other factors as well. When I started flying for TWA, I basically had the choice of being a school teacher, a nurse, a housewife, or an airline hostess. TWA always used the word hostess. We were never stewardesses with TWA. Airline hostess. United and American did use the terminology stewardess. Initially, I did not like the job, and I walked in and quit. They told me to think about it. I went back to my job at the ad agency. They told me they'd take me back, but to think about it. I went back, and from that day on, I fell in love. And it was my love, and it's a life experience, like I said, that is almost surreal. During this time, I was based in Kansas City, Los Angeles, San Francisco, St. Louis, and a tip assignment in New York City. I've been an airline hostess, an instructor, a flight service manager, a purser, a supervisor, a temporary manager. I wrote speeches for management to give because I'm such a walking, talking history of TWA. It was easier to ask me than look it up. And I wrote some of the announcements that you've heard on board the aircraft. We're going to move on. I passed out my business cards to let you know who is speaking to you. Also, our training beyond airline hostess, and I placed a manual on the table. That is one of 2 manuals that we must learn, be tested on, and be able to apply before we will get off probation. And in addition to that, in the office was a 3rd manual that was called the MPMP. And we had to score 90% on our test to graduate from training. So I personally, Bill says he has not, have given CPR 5 times. 4 times on board the aircraft and once in Bridgeton at one of your stores. And he lived. SS McCall said he did fine. So that includes safety. The primary reason for a flight attendant being on board the aircraft is for safety. And it's regulated by the FAA and the government. They're called FARs. As I'm speaking, if anyone has a question, I invite you to ring your flight attendant call button and let me know. Okay? As we move on, I wanted to point out economically and socially how TWA did influence Bridgeton, your parents' lives, and your own and our culture, especially in all communities. But I put my graduation picture in the display, and you would notice that we all looked alike. We were not from similar backgrounds necessarily, but we all fit a certain type. And I understand I was the average standard. I'm 5 feet 4 inches tall, I weighed 103 pounds while I flew. That's why my uniform's not zipped up. Don't ask me to turn around. Okay. And most people had a college degree when I started. I know of only 3 that did not, and they had 2 years of college minimum. It was a highly sought after job. TWA had over 10,000 applicants annually at that time. The year I was hired, they hired 800. 600 graduated and 300 made it through probation. We were a very select group of people. Because of Howard Hughes, we were the airline of the stars, so we met many celebrities. I passed out a celebrity list in case you want to know anything about a certain celebrity. Bill also has a celebrity list that doesn't, that I did not have those people on board as well. How we influenced Bridgeton economically is we were one of the first equal opportunity employers. We had a base in Hong Kong. But my graduation picture, like I said, you can point out we all looked alike. And we were all of one race. That ended the very next year. No graduation pictures will look like that again. TWA was a forerunner. I flew with and knew well what to me was the first African-American flight attendant. Susan Hall, our general manager, said there was one in New York before that time. Her name was Joanne Harper. She had 2 college degrees. And she was a wonderful person. But TWA, as an equal opportunity employer, hired all nationalities and races for frontline, top pay scale jobs. If that was a top pay scale, I started out at $3.38 a month and 45 cents per diem. Also, TWA had a female flight attendants union. Most women at that time were not members of a union. We were the first group of women to ever go out on strike. What were we striking for? Something that I have watched through my years benefit all women in all jobs everywhere. The pilots had pensions, we did not. The pilots' wives had dental care, we did not. TWA management said that flight attendants would not strike. They did what they were told to do. They also said we did not need more than 45 cents an hour for eating and tips and this and that while out on a trip, that women did not eat as much as men do. I'm pointing out these changes. We forget how much our world has changed since 1965 when I started, and 47 years later when I finally parked the last uniform in the back of the closet. These are the changes, and TWA was a big part of them. I've seen the economists and financial consultants on TV say TWA failed and did not make it because the St. Louis population and economy could not support a major airline. This economist did not really consider the fact TWA knew that. We moved here and we were injecting money and people into the economy. At the time that TWA first made St. Louis a hub, and at our peak during that time, we were operating more than 800 flights in and out of St. Louis daily. And we were bringing in 500,000 to 500,000 people monthly. And the money and the support systems for the aircraft and catering was millions of dollars. But on the side, being from Iowa, and going to college in Missouri. I also advised our general manager that Lindbergh, of course, is gone. Howard Hughes had been pushed out. Wall Street took us over. I said we cannot succeed in the St. Louis hub with a New York City mentality. We must make ourselves known as caring in the community. It's a Midwestern community, a large city, but you don't go in and take their money and run. They notice. So TWA established some charitable organizations that we were doing to help the St. Louis community, and one was Elliott School. With so many school teachers in our employee base, we were doing volunteer teaching at Elliott School, and we were supplying necessary items for this school. And we did a very successful reading program with them. It's one of the inner city schools, and this is little done to the St. Louis community. And the TWA employees really took an avid interest in this. Also, another employee-based contribution to the community was called Operation Liftoff. And this included ground services, customer services, reservations, in-flight services, and pilots. The TWA employees had fundraisers, and we raised money to take terminally ill children on dream vacations. And we funded this, and it was the employees, not management. I had many of these children on the airplane, and it brings tears to my eyes. And if someone had a death in the family, or a child had to travel out of town for medical assistance, we sent them on their trip out of this fund. And I have found out many people did not know this. Now, Bill said he was born in 1963, the day all the rest of us remember. So he came onto the scene. He said he started becoming interested in TWA as a young child. I'm going to step aside for just a moment and let him come forward with his perception as a resident of St. Louis and a young child and what TWA meant to him and the influence in his life. And while he's doing this, I'm going to pass candy like we did on the flights in 1965.
She's kind of polite.
Keep me going.
My name is Bill Vance. I was born and raised in St. Louis. She says it's 63. I grew up in this area. I grew up in Maryland Heights. Went to Pattonville Senior High. Went to Rose Acres. I went to Penn Junction. So I'm very familiar with the area, and I'm still in the area. Growing up as a child, I was always very fond of commercial aircraft. I was the modeler of the family. I remember having them strung from the ceiling. A particular example, the 7-4. I had, it must have been 6 inches around. I saved my money for a year or more to get that thing this big. It was a monster. I wish I still had it.
Bill, I'm going to interrupt a minute. Tell them why I'm passing this candy.
So the air pressure won't.
Exactly.
harm your ears.
Before the cuts in costs, when Howard Hughes was pouring all his fortune into us, we did this before every takeoff and landing in coach as well as first class.
So, my story began with St. Louis and Seaswell. I grew up in the area. I went to school, graduated from Pattonville. I went to work for Famous Bar. You all probably remember that. I started at Northwest Plaza in the China and Crystal department. You can believe that. And quickly moved up the ranks. I became a manager with the company and moved to South County, and they had a department or a floor area generating over $10 million annually, a staff of 32 people. I did that for about 7 years, and then at that age, in my 20s, you know, you want to start looking for, in the 80s especially, the roaring 80s, things were just hopping. You could have a job anywhere. And so I threw out an application knowing very well that it was difficult to get in. As she had mentioned, there were thousands of applications of people across the country and the world applying for these jobs. Well, they called me right in, and I got right in. I started with the line in 1989 and worked 11 years for TWA. I never made it more than a reserve cabin attendant. I never made it to service manager because all of these fine people didn't leave. So I never held a line. I was always what was called on call, let's say. It wasn't as bad as you may think, but starting in 1989, the area here was very dynamic for McDonnell Douglas. My dad worked for McDonnell Douglas, and he had a brand new house in Hazelwood, even by Village Square, as a child, an infant even. So it was very, what's the word, aerospace oriented in the first place. TWA wasn't a factor back then. Kansas City was more the element, you might say. And I think
TWA was the biggest employer in the Kansas City region at the time that I started with TWA.
And at that time, too, I do remember there was bases of crew and equipment spread across the country in multiple places. San Francisco, LA, Kansas City, Chicago, St. Louis, New York. These are all store areas of equipment and people and revenue, you might say, for a community. And Lambert Field was not what I call very active at that time. This is again before I started. I guess I'm off track a little.
I'm gonna let you talk about it.
TWA made a choice at one point to condense a hub in Kansas City. At that time, they were operating out of the downtown airport in Kansas City, right on the river. And there was, the logistics of that was not going to work. They designed a new airport. TWA was going to heavily invest in supersonic aircraft at that time. They needed huge airports for jumbo jets. They had big goals, golden ticket, the whole bit. So Kansas City eventually did build that new airport. If you don't understand it, it's up near St. Joe. It's like 50 miles out of town. Somehow that didn't work, and they decided to come to St. Louis. So you've got this organization that's multi-hubbed, condensing and condensing and condensing and gelling up into smaller, fewer hubs, and that brought talent, people, equipment, revenue into a more congested area. St. Louis eventually got the main hub. They decided to keep Kansas City as a maintenance base. So really what I think the way Bridgeton grew was the condensing of all the people. I mean, we all want to live by the airport, we all had to come here to work. You were all over the place. You said San
I was all over the
San Francisco, Kansas City, well, eventually we ended up here.
Actually,
and
we
everyone
have-
else did too.
We have two people, I'm gonna interrupt, we have two people in the audience that can also help explain that too. On the back row is one of my very best friends, Miss Otera Sandberg. She works for U.S. Foods. Please, Otera, will you stand up? She understands the amount of food that TWA was purchasing from U.S. Foods. It was a large account, was it not?
It was a great account. And I remember all the grapefruit and orange sections that they used to buy. It was really fantastic. No one ever sold that many sections of grapefruit and oranges.
Can you give us an estimate of the dollar amount monthly or annually?
Well, actually, I can't remember that because then I had candy in my mouth.
That's why I asked it first before I asked you to speak. I think ahead.
Then the dollar inflation has so much affected how much food costs. And I can't really remember then because And even if I couldn't remember, it wouldn't mean as much as, because $1,000 then is probably $4,000 or $5,000 now. So, because now that I think about it, I do remember, I believe that the fruit sections were probably about $1,500 a week, but then that was in the 60s, so, or early 70s. So that wasn't, it was just an ungodly amount of money. It was amazing, it was fantastic that TWA was here to help support the Bridgeton and the St. Louis area.
Thank you, Otera. I'm going to ask someone else to speak up. He says, "Better you going to speak about Ozark?" I said, "I'm going to let you speak about Ozark." I sat next to these people in the church for many, many years. What would you have to say on Ozark's behalf on how TWA affected Bridgeton?
Well, Ozark established the hub in St. Louis first.
Yes, Peggy Bourne.
And we were the original airline for Bridgeton.
Yes,
We,
you were. They predated TWA's.
right, we started, Ozark started September 26, 1950, with 3 airplanes flying from Springfield, Missouri to Kansas City to St. Louis, eventually went all the way up to Chicago. We were on a temporary certificate in 1955. That's the year that I started with Ozark. We got a permanent certificate, and when Jimmy Carter did deregulation in 1972, that we were able to fly anywhere that we wanted to fly within the United States. And so we started flying all over, really, all over the country. Went from coast to coast, border to border, and we had a great relationship with TWA. That TWA and Ozark, we were rivals, and as far as carrying people, you know, that like you said, that you had 800 flights a day, we had 600 flights a day.
One of my best friends also here in St. Louis from days past was the general manager of Ozark Airlines, Peggy Bourne. And I call her before I make any comments about Ozark because I'm old TWA. But I'm going to get into anecdotes, and we want to hear yours as well. TWA was when I went through training, we were still flying the Connie. I was the last class trained on the piston airplane. I was the first class trained on the 727. We also had the 707. We were the first jet airline. We started the 707 in 1959, San Francisco to New York, back and forth. And the Convair 80, which Howard Hughes bought 20 of those and gave to TWA as a gift. Thank you, Howard. I wish he was still alive today and could give us gifts like that, do you not? But my father was ill, and I had to commute from Kansas City to Des Moines, Iowa, to visit my father in the hospital. TWA did not at the time have that route, but Ozark did. I got on one of Ozark's Fairchilds in Des Moines to fly back to Kansas City. And we hit turbulence, and I became actively ill. At the same time, another passenger noticed she was in my high school class and goes, "Janet, what do you do for a living now?" And I'm going, "I fly for TWA." I've never gotten over the embarrassment. The truth is, I flew the Connie 2 times, and I was actively ill the entire time. If I'd been born a little earlier, I never could have been a flight attendant. That's my first experience with Ozark Airlines. And I'm sure all of you have experiences like that. I'm going to go into, and I'm going to address some of and when you hear people say these things, they are saying it as they know it. But one of the things I want to bring forth is, while I was in management in the Western region, I attended I was not based in the hub at the time, but I attended the staff meetings for management in New York at that time, and was forced, because I was junior management, to have to be seated at the table with the owner of TWA at the time, which you all know was Carl Icahn. As Peggy Bourne brought out, when I said I'm going to write on our display of TWA and Ozark joined October 27th, 1986. She says TWA bought Ozark. This is true, but TWA treated it as a merger. We gave the Ozark people their seniority. It was adjusted as the former TWA employees' seniority had been adjusted through the years. So therefore, some people didn't understand the adjustments, but they got their seniority. They got our pay scale. They were allowed to be trained on every airplane, and with their seniority, they could actually move into other domiciles, which at the time, LA, San Francisco, New York, St. Louis, and fly any aircraft. They could fly domestic or international. We treated it as a merger. And I'm going to stand here right now and say that I was at the meeting, and this is one of the things I want to say, that Mr. Icahn did stand up before the people at the meeting and say, we bought Ozark Airlines for their routes and for their airplanes. We don't need their employees, but we will keep them. When he said we don't need them, everyone almost passed out. And he said, we will keep them. And some people don't believe that it was TWA management that gave them their seniority. They believe it was the union. It was Mr. Icahn. Not everybody's all bad and not everybody's all good. But I have to say, I was there. And very few people were at that meeting. There were very few. But I heard it, and that is for the record. What did cause the demise of TWA? I'm going to go into that. Deregulation. You just stated it helped Ozark, but it hurt the major airlines, primarily Pan Am and TWA most. When I started with TWA, United and TWA were the biggest airlines. And we were the most prestigious. We wore designer uniforms, and we rode in limousines, and we were treated like celebrities. Deregulation hurts. It gave all the advantages and opportunities to the upstart airlines with the same costs and rules, basically and primarily for the old airlines. It threw them at an extreme disadvantage. The next thing is, as Bill was addressing as well, they forced Howard Hughes out, and Wall Street, the New York banks took over TWA. Howard Hughes did not care if we turned a profit. We were a lot of fun, and he enjoyed us. And we actually used Rosenthal China, and were handed out to the passengers. We weren't taught in training to economize. Wall Street wanted a profit. They sold TWA routes and airplanes to diversify. They built Hilton hotels, and they brought Century 21, and we're not putting money into new airplanes, and we're not putting money into routes. They were selling routes. Also, how many remember Braniff Airlines? Yes, we all did. Braniff Airlines was a good airline. Probably gave Ozark a little trouble down there. But they were a good airline. And I remember this, I was there. All of a sudden, in the 80s, we started having false bookings on our airplanes. We pull up the passenger manifest. It would say full. We would sit at the gate area, and there would be 1 or 2 passengers. This started happening to TWA and to Braniff. It forced Braniff out. It hurt TWA, it crippled us, and it went on for a period of time. Lawsuits were filed, accusations were made, they never went to court. Yes.
Well, if the planes only had 2 people in it, who made all the reservations that said there were people on it?
Well, one could be suspicious of a competitor. This is being filmed. But yes, a competitor was what Brenda filed a lawsuit against. It never went to court, but it crippled us terribly because the difference in a charter and a commercial airplane, a charter, if we were a charter today and you didn't show up, we wouldn't have to fly that airplane. But a scheduled commercial flight has to go. If it has one person, it has to go. It was scheduled, so we had to fly, and it was at a great cost. This crippled us and made us vulnerable for Carl Icahn to buy us. And from there, after Carl Icahn was forced out, the employees at the last stages of the ballgame owned TWA. But as Bill and I said, I never met Bill while I was flying. I met him here in the library. When people asked me, did I like my job, I looked forward to going to work. I picked up extra trips to go to work more. I loved my job, and as I was driving to work, I felt sorry for everyone else in the world that they didn't have my job. It didn't matter if they made millions more than I did. It didn't matter if their cars were bigger, their offices beautiful, to the point that when I had vacation, my crew asked me to fill out a pass and go with them on the trip anyway, and I did. So now, we are going to, I passed out a list of celebrities that we have met, and I invite each one of you to share an experience with us, or to ask a question of either me or Bill.
I'm going to just make a comment to you, because I have got a very good friend who left college and took a job, TWA, as a reservationist. And that would have been around 1960 or maybe right before that. And she dearly loved that job. And she met so many people over the phone making reservations, and they would invite her to come, you know, oh, well, we've got an opening on the seat on the plane or something like that, why don't you join us? And she wound up going to the Kennedy inauguration. It was fantastic. I mean, she just told such fantastic stories. And then she wound up, she got married, she had a couple of kids, and she stopped working, and she missed traveling. The opportunity to travel was so ingrained in my friend Sue that she went back and worked at TWA for many years afterwards. But I mean, she just enjoyed the idea of, you know, being able to have, you know, what we call, I guess, the frequent flyer would be like. You know,
Very
equivalent
disjointed
today.
feeling when you don't get to be able to jump on an aircraft and win.
That's right. She loved, you were talking about you loved your job. She adored that job.
It was fantastic. Through having General Harrison on the airplane, I was asked to be the tour guide for the Crown Prince of Bahrain during his tour of Port Leavenworth. You know, I sometimes become afraid to tell these stories. I'm afraid people will think I'm a bit of a fiction writer. So I have dined with who is now King of Bahrain. He was the most polite, intelligent person, interesting, but he thought it very humorous and amusing that a woman drove a car. So he had his bodyguards in a Cadillac, but he much preferred to ride in the car with me. And I was kind of like, oh yes, the Crown Prince, and it was a group of us would go out, the colonels and the majors and whatever, military people. Until one night I had laid out our route to the restaurant, to his bodyguards, and I made a wrong turn. That Cadillac whipped in front of me, I was pulled out of the car, I was slammed up the roof, and I realized I am indeed driving the Crown Prince of Bahrain road. The other is I met Dean Martin, and he was just exactly like he is on television and in the movies, but it came about that I studied dancing. At his invitation, I danced at opening nights in his show at the Riviera in Las Vegas. I called my father and I said, oh, those lessons you paid for. I said, Did you ever think I would dance in Las Vegas? And my father said, I always hoped not.
One quick interruption, we've got fresh coffee and hot water and refreshments, please.
Anybody want a
Feel
break?
free
Help
to get up
yourself.
anytime, this is informal, and help yourself.
Some people may have to leave. I'm going to tell you, the video wasn't working. The first one I was showing was Somewhere Over the Rainbow, filmed by Hollywood. I have Sky High, which was on Channel 9 PBS, the history of TWA. And I also have the Papal Charter. We were the Pope's airline. And this is the interior of the airplane as we did for the Pope. I invite all of you to help yourselves to refreshments. And anyone that wants to see these videos, I will find a way to make them available to you.
Can I
Yes.
ask you another question? Because I'm looking at the different styles of
Yes.
airplanes. Compared to today, when you get into an airplane and the seats, you know, how much room there is. Give me the equivalence of when you were flying, you know, when you first started flying. What was the size of the airplanes?
Okay, the size of the airplane, the Boeing 707, we had three configurations of it. We had the domestic, they were called the water wagon with the water injection for the engines to cool them for takeoff. The domestic version, we had the international version. The water injection was not necessary in later models. And we had the back configuration, which we flew on the Vietnam routes. And this still brings tears to my eyes. I had the young soldiers going to Vietnam, and I would bid them goodbye. And someone threw their arms around me, and one said something I'll never forget. He said, if I live through this and I come back, I'm going to try to marry a nice girl like you. And I've never, ever forgotten. And truthfully, every time I find out someone's a Vietnam vet, I kind of quiz them. The odds against it ever being a 1. But the Vietnam thing was real. The Vietnam thing had a strong influence on flight attendants refusing to quit. I had to sign a paper that I would quit when I turned age 34. And I was supposed to have found my husband by then, or I was a failure in life, not a success. 60,000 young, wonderful men went to Vietnam and didn't come back. And I refer to my generation of flight attendants as the Vietnam widows. That's why many didn't marry and why many had to continue on working. My college sweetheart was one of the casualties, and an Air Force pilot that I had started dating was one of the casualties. So we did have a direct beginning. Yes, Glenda.
Hi, Cheryl Searcy used to visit the China you all used in first class.
Yes.
Oh, my.
Cheryl.
Cheryl Searcy, come forward. We want to
Oh, I don't
hear
want to
from
walk up. I'll take it with me.
you. Okay, this is Glenda from my prayer group.
Hi. I will. I'm gonna watch his foot and my foot.
The
and
China
that
back
pole.
during Howard Hughes days was Rosenthal. It was the real thing. I'm going to set it on the table over here, Glenda, so that the people can, because it is the real thing. You belong on camera.
I'll say this about this. This was wonderful to work with, except this cup. I never used this cup.
Is that the
Bert
cup?
and
This is coffee cup.
I couldn't remember if that was.
I don't know how anyone would enjoy a cup of out of
That
this.
little bitty cup.
And I certainly wasn't gonna run up and down the aisle every time everyone took 2 drinks out of it. Out of what, was the front camp of 16, 20 people, I didn't be running coffee pots up and down.
Well, it reduced our coffee bill. We weren't ordering as much coffee for US Foods, correct? Yes. Why don't you stand up? Stand up, come up, get on camera. You're a cartoon. Yes, ma'am, come on up here. You know when we had flight delays on the runway in New York, I would start with my Johnny Carson routine, and the longer it came, I would make all the first-class passengers come up and do a Johnny Carson monologue.
Oh,
So being active on the flight and part of the entertainment was part of it. And I can take the floor, dear. She was here.
I started in 1978 at the old A&D store, TWA reservations. And my friend actress Sandy Corsi, she was also with TWA, eventually America. We were called the backbone of the airline because we were the first person we talked to regarding airline reservations or traveling on the wonderful airline. We didn't go travel with you, but we sent you on your way, and you wanted to know what the price was. We always start with the lowest. We tried to ease you in every way, and it was a wonderful airline. We had wonderful parties. We had wonderful times, and I traveled to many places which I would never have gone to had I not gone there. Thank you
Thanks.
for your help in sending me on my trips.
Thank you for your input. Yes, we have money.
Who owns TWA now?
TWA, American Airlines bought
Okay, so
TWA,
why
it
do
no
they
longer
still carry
exists.
Susie?
Huh?
Why do they still carry the logo?
They don't.
They own it.
American Airlines owns the logo. These are two pictures of the past.
Yeah.
These are pictures before American Airlines bought us. This exists no more except in pictures and movies. While she was talking about what a family we were, I'm going to share something with you about what a family we were. My father had cancer for 4 years. And during those 4 years, I flew every one of my trips without missing a trip and made it back and forth to Iowa to help take care of him. With the great help of Ozark Airlines, as I mentioned. But at the last, I was scheduled for a turnaround to California. I called the doctor and he said, I said, after that I had 5 days off that are my own. He said, take the trip. We got to California and our airplane broke down. I called the hospital, the doctor, and he said, you must get here now. It's not going as well as I thought it was. We changed pilots. We had a pilot that had been on a layover, walk off on the airplane, and he said, this airplane is in such bad shape, it's captain's option on whether or not to fly it. And one of the girls went up to him and said, we have to fly home, there's no other flight, and Janet's father is done. This captain had never seen me before in his life. He called me aside and he said, is this true? And I said, yes, it is. He said to the customer service agent, book all of the passengers on another airplane, and we will be ferrying this airplane to Kansas City for overhaul. And maybe I'm exaggerating the story or not, but I understand we may have left some parts on the runway as we took off that night. But I had my own flight to Kansas City. We flew that airplane for overhaul, and I made it. I made it and got to talk to my father again. We did those things for each other. We loaned each other money, clothes, took each other in. We were a family. It was a relationship. I can best describe as sororities and fraternities in college with military rules and regulations. Yes, yes.
And
What-
that's probably the biggest thing that kept me there.
what do you think of the new stewardesses and flight attendants and airline life today?
I love them all. They kept me alive. In California, they called me into the office one day and said, Jenna, have you ever been a mother? I said, no. They said, would you like to be one? I said, mm-hmm. They said, well, you're going over to the hotel and live with several hundred new flight attendants as their house mother. And you know, they became my kids. I loved every one of them. And they would invade my room, call me in the middle of the night. I was tearing my hair out. And then half my age said, Janet, jump in the swimming pool. No way was I putting on my swimming suit around those youngsters, but they kept, TWA, I brought the manual, one, I said there were 3, but also when you went to the airport, you had a mailbox, you have a list this high. It was ever changing, minute by minute, updated. It was a younger industry versus the railroads and other things, and it was ever changing and you had to stay updated. I love the new people, I love their ideas, I invited their ideas. They were inspiring, they kept the rest of us young. And Bill can tell you, did you feel welcome